Are video games getting too large? That is the question of the day. And I want to be clear when I ask, are they getting too large? I'm not talking about the scope of the game. I'm not talking about how long the game takes to complete. I'm talking about the storage footprint of the game. How much storage on your device, on your console, on your PC do you need to play this game, to install this game? And this video is inspired by the news recently that the Final Fantasy VII Remake coming out on the Switch 2 is going to take up around 100 gigs of console storage. So it's being released on a game key card. Don't get me started on the game key cards, but so it's not going to be a physical game and it's going to require 100 gigabytes of storage. And of course, the Switch 2 was released with 256 gigabytes of storage. And yes, it can be expanded, but just the base console itself, this one game is going to take up, close to half of the storage. So that's prompted me to think about this, and I have some thoughts, have some ideas, but I wanted to get into the topic, to the question, are video games getting too large? And I want to go back down memory lane, do a little history lesson, and talk about the early days, the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, the PS1. And back then, it was a different time for gaming. And what I've realized, what I've thought about is that when game developers were starting a new project, when they were developing games, they had a constraint right from day one, right? Something they had to keep in mind before they even started their project. And that was a storage constraint, right? How much storage is available on the media that they're going to be shipping this game on, right? So if it's a Super Nintendo game, there's only a limited amount of storage on the cart. If it's a PS1 game, you're limited by the disk storage, right? So developers had to approach their projects, approach their games with that in mind. And there really wasn't any way to exceed that, right? I mean, there were some edge cases on the PS1. They could release games as multiple discs, for example. And, I always love those double jewel cases, those 4 disc games, Final Fantasy IX, for example. So there were some workarounds, but by and large, right, there was only so much they could do, and they had to operate within the confines of the media itself. And that kept the storage footprint of games down. So that's the first thing, right? And then as we moved up, into the PS2, PS3 Plus era, things started getting digital and consoles started having more storage. And there was more of a push to reduce load times, right? So what happened is that a couple things. One, what were physical games were becoming digital games, and that would require users to download the games onto their consoles. The second thing was that load times were getting longer, and one of the best ways to bring down load times is to have all the software, directly on the device or into memory. Right? It's always faster to play a game if it's directly on the device as opposed to reading it off of the disk or reading it off of, a Switch card, for example. So we came to this age, and what's ended up happening is that in the early days, like I talked about, the constraint was on the game developer, right? They had to build their products with storage in mind, right? And now we've kind of switched roles, and now the constraint is on the consumer. We need to make sure our devices have enough storage to play their games, right? And they don't need to think about storage constraints because they can release a game that's 100 gigabytes on a cart. And if their game requires more storage, if they can't fit it, no problem, right? Day one download, day one patch, you can download another 50, 100 gigabytes the moment you put that game in your console. So they're really not constrained at all by storage anymore. And this is the main reason, in my opinion, why games have gotten so large. I don't think these games actually require that much storage. I just think when they're developing, when they're working on games, it's not a priority to optimize, to reduce the amount of storage, right? Because again, they're not constrained by the media really anymore. And on top of that, users can expand their storage, right? So we can buy, storage cards, SD cards for our Switches. You can buy bigger hard drives for your PCs. So there's really no motivation anymore for developers to keep games small, especially when these games are large, complex, and they have so many other fires to put out, so many other challenges. I think the last thing they want to spend money on, the last thing they want to spend time on is actually optimizing their games and reducing that storage footprint. So, circling back to the question, have games gotten too large? I think the answer is definitely yes. It's not unusual to see 100 gigabyte, 150 gigabyte, 200 gigabyte plus games. And I want to bring up another good example of this, something I was reading about recently, which is Helldivers 2. So the console editions of Helldivers 2 took up something like, 30 to 40 gigabytes of storage. Not bad, right? But the PC version took up 3 times that, so it was closer to 150 gigabytes of storage. And what the Helldivers team said was that this was by design, and they're actually taking up 3 times as much storage on the PC version to reduce load times. So they're using up, 100 gigabytes plus more storage on the user's device to bring down the load time for their game. And they said that they're actually duplicating code, right? They're duplicating files, software to bring those load times down. So the game itself still is roughly the same size as console version, but they're just duplicating those assets in some way so they can bring down the load times. And it's kind of interesting that storage these days is such a low priority, and load times is like all the craze, right? Every time there's a new console release, they always want to showcase, highlight, we've reduced load times by 50%. We're reducing load times. As if the load times are even that terrible in the first place. I mean, let's be real, better load times is better, but like how big of an issue is it to have a 50%, a 5 second, a few second longer load time? And I think that's just a result these days of people's attention spans getting shorter and shorter, YouTube shorts, TikToks, that kind of thing. But the priority is totally on load times now and not at all on storage. And I think we're going to continue to see that as we go forward. I don't think there's any push to reduce game sizes. In fact, I think it's just going to get worse and worse. I think, as I said, it's just not a priority. And this is really also, tied into the push to the digital age because as things become digital, as games become digital, if they're no longer on the physical card, if you can't play them off, a Switch 2 card, then you need to download them and store them on your device, right? And the Final Fantasy remake on the Switch 2 is going to be only a game key card or digital. So you can't get a physical, you can't play it off the card. So you're going to need that storage. And the biggest pain point with this, really, as a user, is having to manage your storage, right? And I find I get hit by this the most on the PS5. Anytime I need to install a new PS5 game, I'm shuffling things around, I'm deleting things, installing. It's just such a pain to have to deal with. But that's the future we're in. And the last thing I want to talk about is like, where is this all going in the end? And is storage going to continue to be a pain in the future? And I think it's definitely going to be a pain for the considerable future. But I do also think they're trying to push even farther into that digital age to a place where you don't even need to download the game, right? You're going to basically stream the game, you're going to log in, and your device is just going to be an interface, a monitor essentially, to play the game on their hardware. So you're going to need internet, fast internet. And think about it just like Netflix, right? When you watch a movie on Netflix, you're not downloading the whole movie up front before you're watching it. You're essentially streaming it, right? The movie exists only on their servers, and what's needed, is loaded in to your TV as the movie's playing. And I think gaming is going to go in that direction eventually. I think if they could do that now, they probably would. I just think the technology is not quite there yet, latency, issues like that. But I really think, they want to go as digital as possible And if they can get away with consumers not having the software at all, not even digitally downloaded, I think they would gladly do that. And I think personally that's where we're headed, but that's a different topic. So let's circle back. Let's end this video. Let me know your thoughts. Do you think games are getting too big? Are they taking up too much storage? Do you find it painful to have to manage that storage? Drop a comment below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. And that's it. Have a good day.